we have an amazing panel about the S in ESG. I would like to start, I think, with David Craig, my, I guess, kind of ex-boss, who's now at the London Stock Exchange Group running Refinitiv, which used to be known as the Thomson Reuters terminal business, which you've been running for many years. David, why don't you introduce yourself a little, just very briefly, and explain what it is that you're doing on this panel?
Well, Felix, it's great to see you again, and thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. So I'm head of data analytics and CEO of Refinitiv at LSEG, London Stock Exchange Group. And in the area of ESG, we've been collecting this data set for our clients, our financial investors and traders in the financial community for about 16 years. And I've seen a lot of change in the last few years, particularly around the E, the S, and not least the G of ESG data, particularly in the last, I'd say, 18 months, a 5 to sometimes 10 times increase for investors of all parts of the ESG data. So I think what's interesting about the S is when companies talk about a sustainable approach to the societies that they work in, the S is really about the broader set of sustainability beyond climate, which of course has a huge amount of tension, the E. And there's a lot of discussion around putting the S first and foremost in ESG as well. So what does it mean? It means, how does a company look after its employees? How does it look after the communities that it works in? And how does it take an interest both in its products, its sourcing, its footprint in the societies that they operate? And of course, it's getting a lot more attention, and possibly because of COVID has reminded us that the societies and nature is quite fragile, and we as CEOs of large companies need to be taking care of how we're looking after the communities. And investors are taking an interest in that as well. So I think the S, rightly so, is getting a lot more attention at the moment.
So tell me a little bit about what you do in terms of quantifying and communicating the progress that various businesses are able to make on that particular front. And you say you've been doing this for 15, 16 years. Yeah, how much progress have you made in terms of being able to really give people quantitative analytics on this?
Well, I would say when we started doing this many years ago, the data was kind of ahead of the problem. I think, and I would say now, the problem is ahead of the data. So a lot of the things that investors, and we'll hear from one in a moment, are looking for, the data isn't necessarily available. So there's a lot of catch up happening at the moment around data standards, about data definition, data contribution. Just take the area like ethnicity, and after the terrible events last year, the George Floyd murder in the US, a lot of investors started saying, well, what are companies doing about ethnicity? And how do we measure that? And we looked at the ESG data and said, actually, there's almost no real data that's usable about ethnicity. So we've created a taxonomy according to industry standards and testing that around the metrics that can be collected around ethnicity in leadership, on pay equality, and a number of things. And are working right now actually with Fortune magazine on recutting the Fortune 500 using that data. It's just one good example of where the data can be put to use on more transparent disclosures on things that society is starting to care a lot about now, and investors are starting to care about as well.
Antonio, let me come to you. You're at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. What do you think of when you think of the S and ESG? Are you thinking about the ethnicity of senior management, or are you thinking something completely different?
We are also looking at diversity and inclusion as part of the data that we look at, but we're also looking at supply chain risks. We're also looking at data and digital rights. We're also looking at socioeconomic inequality. I think, back to David's point, we've seen a lot of progress in the past decade for sure in the adoption of E and the G, but we've seen how the S is effectively lagging behind. And there are a number of reasons that we have outlined in this white paper that we are going to be releasing also in partnership with Refinitiv in April. And we call them misconceptions. The fact that effectively there is an understanding that or misconception to the point that there is a lack of data, investors don't really know where to start from, that they see environmental risks as more material than the social risks, or that they perceive that because they are working under the jurisdiction of a specific government in a country where specific legislation applies, that effectively is up to the government and not to the private sector to look at as risks. But as risks are effectively risky. If you look at supply chain, we know everybody remembers Rana Plaza a couple of years ago. You just have to go back a couple of months and see what happened, for example, to the shares of Boohoo back in August 2020. I mean, Boohoo lost $2 billion out of its market cap because of implications of poor labor conditions within the supply chain. So we're looking at a number of indicators. Diversity and inclusion is one, but supply chain is definitely another one.
And tell me a little bit about what do you do at what does the foundation actually do on this front? When you say you're looking at these indicators, how do you look at them and what do you do with them once you've found them?
So, I mean, at the foundation, we sit at a really interesting crossroads of stakeholders. So we work with media professionals, we work with legal professionals, and with the private sector and with governments. So often our role is to convene these different stakeholders and to foster a dialogue. So the white paper that we are going to be releasing effectively wants to start a dialogue, wants to start a conversation. We work very closely with Refinitiv and other partners on this group, and we really looked at what's out there, what kind of data sets are out there, but also what kind of frameworks are out there, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to PRI. I mean, there's a number of tools that are there that can already be adopted. What we wanted to do was to package everything up and effectively encourage the private sector to start looking more professional, if you want, and more systemically at the S indicators of ESG. So our role is very much, to explain it very simply, as a convener who wants to start a dialogue that has necessarily to involve different stakeholders within the coalition.
And so tell me, I mean, obviously on the E side, people love to use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of ground, a sort of basic ground upon which to build. On the G side, there's a lot of consensus about where people want to go and what to measure. On the S side, you mentioned the UN declaration. Is there any broad consensus about where people want to start? Is that the best place to start?
I think that the UN guiding principles for business and human rights are definitely a good point to start. And if you look at them, they talk very clearly about protecting, about respecting, and they talk about very clearly about the concept of remediation, which is a very interesting concept to look at. So that is definitely a starting point. SASB is another good point. There is a lot of resources out there. What we notice is obviously different companies are looking at different data sets or different frameworks, and that doesn't create data sets, to David's point, that then can be analyzed holistically and implemented holistically, and therefore companies can be ranked against the same benchmark. And that is part of the problem. The data sets, the framework are there, the data sets are there, but need to be improved significantly. And as an investor, you're left in the dark. You don't know what you are buying. I made this example last time when we were connected about the Modern Slavery Act 2015 here in the UK, which is starting to effectively oblige companies which have a revenue of about 36 million to make a modern slavery statement, effectively saying we're doing something about it, or simply we're doing nothing about it. The act is not mandatory. It's mandatory about 36 million, but you can simply say as a company, we're actually doing nothing. But then effectively you are passing the risk to the investors that then are going to be including or not your stock in a fund, or they're buying the stock themselves. So these mechanisms are starting to come up, and effectively more accountability will pop up through the chain of investors, and it's already happening.
So David, that is then presumably something that if I have a Refinitiv terminal, I can see if I can call up any UK company above 36 million and find out whether or not they have a report on the degree to which slavery may or may not be in their supply chain. That's like a nice little self-reported data point that you can incorporate into your data, right?
That's right, but I think we have to be aware of the limit of this. The way that ESG data has changed is it's gone from a negative check, is this company that I'm investing in involved in gambling? Is it involved in firearms or mines or alcohol production? Those are the sort of old-fashioned, I want a negative screen, to now I think investors are looking for more about, well, how do I score and how do I look at materiality and how do I be far less black and white and far more sort of investing in the areas where progress is making. So I think, yes, you're right, but the way the data is moving is far more from a sort of negative check and a negative almost compliance screen according to a portfolio criteria into more a progressive forward-looking screen of where can I identify the companies that are making progress on this and invest behind it. And that, I think, is a reflection of how investment sentiment is also changing to do that. But if that company, and if it's a public company in particular in the UK, and if that regulation is in place, then they need to disclose it, then we would capture that data. If they decide to disclose it, even though they don't have to, they may want to do that, we will also try and capture that data. So you do have a little bit of a patchy network. We cover 8,000 public companies, we cover thousands of private companies, but the private companies generally don't need to disclose as much. And I think that's where the challenge is moving. How do we get the private universe involved in this? Because there are thousands more private companies than public companies in the world that are all managing supply chains and dealing or affecting some of these issues.
And even if you're just looking at the 8,000 public companies, and even if you're just looking at the S factors within ESG, I understand that you have like 140 different metrics that you report on, which feels unwieldy to say the least. That's the next job, right? Is to sort of like boil that down a bit.
Well, the problem is S can mean many different things to different people. And so whilst, alcohol or firearms might be important here, supply chain slavery and stopping that might be important for this audience. And so the data universe is trying to keep everyone happy, if you like. But what you do find is investors tend to focus on several areas based on where they are today. So we have to be comprehensive in that. But that also
so
means
I want to ask you about that. Like, how comprehensive are you? Like, you have 140 different indicators. You have 8 public companies. Of those 140 indicators, like, how many of them would you say that even most of the 8,000 companies have data on?
So very few companies will report on everything. And it depends on the local rules and the regulation, what country they're from. It also depends on the data that they can collect. So you'll tend to find themes build across, but very few companies will report on all of them because they're either not compiled to, they don't have to do it, or they don't find that that's a measure themselves that they find important for the business that they're in. So whilst we're comprehensive on the fields and the data set, actually for an investor, you still have quite a patchy view of how can I be comprehensive on all of these areas. And that's the difference between the E. I mean, the great news about the work on climate, particularly with scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, is it's pretty well defined now and is becoming very comprehensive in terms of reporting, particularly on the public companies. The S just has a lot further to go. It's earlier days to really figure out the standards on S. And data companies like ourselves are trying to make this easier for companies to both disclose and for the investors to actually absorb that data and put that into their models.
So Jose, you're the investor here. You're wearing a couple of hats on this panel. You are on the board of the RFK Center, but you're also an investor, and you invest in private companies, which I guess is a sort of double-edged sword here, right? That on the one hand, you get to do much more. You, by your nature, do a lot more diligence into companies before you invest in them than some, high-frequency trader going in and out of stocks every 20 seconds. But on the other hand, that data is, it's much harder, or is it? Is it harder to compare companies and to get apples to apples comparisons when you're talking about private companies?
Yeah, Great question, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. In some respects, you're right. Like in the private company sphere, obviously there's a lot less, even less standards or less, kind of frameworks or standard data sets that we can use to compare. On the other hand, though, we are doing private diligence in most of these companies, and then we own them. So I think I will touch back on the accountability point that Antonio mentioned. So we are in a unique position where these companies are fully accountable to us, and also the feedback loop from us, the private equity firm that owns these businesses, to our investors, right? Pension plans, endowments, foundations. That feedback loop also is a lot more compact, right? So for example, I'm talking to my investors about what we're doing on the ESG front, including the E, the S, and the G, and then I can pass that on, or I can actually use that, my position as a chairman of a company or the owner of the business, really push, right? Push in every single aspect of this, and then particularly in the S part, it's been the most amorphous. I think, David mentioned it also means different things to different people, right? When I talk to investors, some of my investors in Europe, they emphasize different aspects of that S versus, kind of investors in the US. But when I look at our portfolio companies, what we have been trying to do is find a standard way of doing the diligence, to your point. So we're oftentimes now we're incorporating that into our standard diligence process, bringing in experts or consultants to help us, kind of standardize the way we look at the E, the S, and the G. And then afterwards, most importantly, we're trying to measure, right, kind of the significant initiatives within those different buckets where we can make a big difference. I think the biggest difference also, in the private sector versus the public sector is that, you mentioned the 140 metrics, right? The problem is that for a lot of public companies or for a lot of companies, 100 of those metrics might be largely irrelevant and 40 of them matter. We have a much better kind of insight into these companies, right? So we can immediately identify the 40 that really matter, try to identify projects or processes or activities that can benefit or can improve those 40 metrics, and then track them. And that accountability and feedback loop, the ability to really narrow down those metrics, focus on them, identify activities or things that we're doing to change them and to make these companies better, I think that makes a big difference, right? Hopefully then we're preparing these companies to enter the public sphere and be much better, corporate citizens once we're done with them.
And then while they're still part of your portfolio, you're measuring those 40 metrics, you're getting time series on them, you're reporting them back to your LPs. Do you have any incentive to share that data with David and make it public to anyone with a Refinitiv terminal?
Yes and no, right? I think certainly it's a question of standardizing, right? Like we need to arrive to a set of standard metrics. We're not adverse, kind of in terms of sharing that progress for a couple of reasons. One, I think my LPs, my investors want more transparency, right? They want to basically be able to see through kind of what we're doing and other private equity firms are doing, to then be able to kind of judge us or compare us on an apples-to-apples basis. So you're seeing, for example, in our industry, private equity firms that voluntarily, essentially, are publishing publicly some of their ESG reports every year. And some of that, there's a marketing component to it, to be quite honest, and an LP relationship component to that. But it also, I think, is a little push towards that, what you're referring to, which is, a world where we all basically, report to some type of central repository, so we can all basically compare ourselves apples to apples. At least in our case, we're trying to get better. We're trying to basically be the best private equity firm out there and have best practices across the board. So it benefits us. I always joke around that in private equity, at least, you can't plagiarize and copy a good idea. So I would love to understand what other people are doing and make what we do better. I think also a subset of our companies aspirationally or have real possibilities of becoming public companies. And I think the more you're doing before you become a public company, but the more you act like a public company before you become a public company, the better prepared you're going to be to enter that public sphere. So I think there are many reasons why private equity firms are becoming more open and less opaque, and might be even potentially willing participants, kind of to some of these public databases or public data repositories, because I do think that there's some incentives pushing us in that direction.
David, is that what you're seeing, or not so much?
Well, I mean, Jose made a couple of points, which is a private company can ultimately end up as a public company. So being ready means you have to start looking at your ESG data, because you're being asked a lot more. I think the other point, and we were owned by a private equity company for several years, and we saw the pressure from the LPs to have a view on this data, and that pressure is really quite immense. But the other important point, of course, and just on what Antonio said about supply chains, which is, they might be a private company, but now their customers are asking them for this data. And so actually getting ahead of that, we supply a lot of our clients. We have thousands of RFPs a year. The ESG questions are just coming up and up and up, along with cyber and other things, where we're being demanded to answer some of these issues before we can get into RFPs and service our customers. So it's becoming the norm for private companies as well as public. It's just got a lot further to go to do it.
So I'd love to bring in Livia at this point from EcoAge, who I think has made here you are, fantastic, great to see you. And it's awesome to have you on the panel. And what I'd love you to do is lay we've talked a lot about where we're at right now in terms of reporting on the S component of ESG. What I'm interested in hearing from you is, like, how do you think about that component? And specifically, you're an expert in the fashion industry. Do you think there are ways of looking at the fashion industry that would basically judge certain business models, would be able to look at, say, the entire fast fashion industry and say that entire industry basically fails some kind of a test? Is that a criterion that should exist?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Nice to see you, everyone. Yes, I mean, for me personally, but also for us at EcoAge, the company that I founded over 10 years ago, we have always talked about sustainability as, encompassing the social component, the social justice part of it, to the point that the social for us has always been more important than the environmental. Because when you think about, you mentioned fashion, which a lot of people might consider like a frivolous industry, but fashion is one of the most polluting industry in the world. The environmental impact is enormous. And also is one of the biggest employer of slave labor. And the two things are not a coincidence, because, ultimately we all know today that wage theft, for example, leads to climate degradation. So when you use huge labor that is based on slave labor, you can produce these huge numbers that fast fashion produce, and and we addicted us to this huge number of, to huge levels of consumption. But so almost the social is where it all starts, because fast fashion, for example, business model wouldn't be possible without exploitation of labor. So it is fundamental. And today the dial is shifting really, really fast, because for a few years it's been a reputational issue. Now it's become actually a compliance and legislation issue, because there is so much is happening. Like even last week with Boohoo, the fast fashion company based in the UK, for example, that was found using slave labor last year. Now the US is thinking of banning Boohoo import into the country. The EU is proposing a legislation about, accountability. So there is a lot that is happening super fast now, because also the global pandemic has taken the veil out of this system. So what is the truth is that to succeed and to have a profitable business in the next few years, we must go further to simultaneously address also the collateral damage to society, because so many businesses only think about environmental, but without living incomes, for example, and dignity of work, the farmers, the workers, whoever they are that we depend on for the goods that we consume, will be forced to quit and seek better futures somewhere else.
So Antonio, I just want to bring in Antonio here. It's like, this is a very, I mean, it seems very clear cut to me what Livia is saying. Like, do you look at other industries as well and say, yeah, there are entire industries here which just on S criteria alone, like no ESG investor should be touching with a 10-foot pole?
Well, I think it's clear that this is a risk that affects different industries. In 2016, for example, we ran an investigation. We call it Blood Mica, and we looked at a number of mines in India in 3 different states: Bihar, Rajasthan, and I think Andhra Pradesh, if I remember correctly. And we did an investigation for 2 months, and in those 2 months, we found out that 5 children of the age of 5, actually, and below 5, actually have died in those mines. And what we also found out is not only that the kids had died, but those deaths were covered up. And effectively, parents were often sending a second child into those mines because effectively those children were the main breadwinners for the family. And we were able to establish links between those mica mines and eventually through the supply chain, Volkswagen, which obviously, as you know, is Europe's biggest car maker. And as a result, Volkswagen dropped the contracts with those mines. So there is a huge reputational issue. To Livia's point, consumers are changing their behaviors, and the role of the media here is really, really, really critical. The media is not going to stop investigating those stories because people want to read those stories, and because it's where the role of the media is really crucial in raising awareness of infringement of human rights through labor rights.
David, tell me, like, when stuff like this comes out, when you talk to someone like Livia talking about the fast fashion industry, if you talk to someone like Antonio talking about mining in India, in what way and how, like, do you have any ability to incorporate that information into your product and to make it easily visible and surface it to people who are looking at those companies, so people aren't just looking at like self-reported information?
Yes, and we do. I mean, the example that Antonio just gave, and the role of the media is very important. I mean, once you're in the media on one of these issues, you're going to be trapped. It doesn't go away. And one of the things that we do is provide that kind of screening and information in a consolidated way. So, you know, money makes a difference here, and if you have a negative screen on one of these issues, be it supply chain, slavery in the supply chain, you know, big environmental issues, some other problems, then you will get noticed if you're in the media, and it'll be used as a screen. And so the financing, the PR reputation, all of these things are very, very damaging. I think the challenge is, you know, what percentage of those are actually reported and what percentage are actually seen. What I would say is that from our own business, we do supply chain screening for thousands of our companies every single day. There's a huge intensity now to people really understand what is through my supply chain, not just 1 level, but 2 levels and 3 levels. And you can imagine how difficult that is. So what are my suppliers doing, and where are they getting their labor from? And how do I know that labor is you know, free, well treated, all the rest of it? Extremely difficult for these large corporations to do it. We do a lot of that work. We help them on that, but it's not easy because they're trying to go 2 or 3 levels down. But there's lots of exciting discussion and experiment around new technology that can help. Digital currencies that have provenance around them, where you know where the money is going, is one idea that has been surfaced by a lot of people about how can I create a supply chain where I really know where the money's going. You know, catching money laundering, anti-terrorism, the catching those areas is an area that we've been working on for 20 years. We screen, the data we use is screening 800 million entities like that every single day. But there's still a lot further to go because people are trying to go through the supply chain. And, you know, Livia talks about the fashion industry. The fashion industry is built off outsourcing. And how do they really understand what is through their supply chain, where are those materials coming from, and what's going on? Companies are pretty paranoid about this at the moment because the negative press and the implications, you know, are tough. It's hard for them to get down through this, but they're certainly spending a lot more attention on it. But I think new technology can offer something which is far less manual and far more automated in the future to make a safer supply chain.
Tell me a little bit about this idea of negative press being something that people can screen for. I know that in the United States, and I think this is maybe a difference between how I look at the world and how someone like Antonio looks at the world. If I talk to people about the social aspects of public companies, the thing that they think about is not slave labor in supply chains. The thing that they think about is what role did Facebook play in the 2016 election. They think about the filter bubbles in big tech. They think about like how can we save democracy from Facebook and Google, and that it seems to me is something that we in the press write about quite a lot. But I wonder whether there's any sort of visible future that you see in the next few years where that might somehow be put into a quantifiable S metric.
Oh, you mean disinformation or the control of information and access?
Or just like, is this company good for civil society and democracy or terrible?
Well, and of course, then you get into a debate about what is good and what is bad when it comes to social media, and I won't pretend to enter into that debate thinking I'm the world's expert.
But wouldn't you have to though? At some point, don't you have to start taking sides on that, because it is such a key part of what people consider to be ESG investing?
I think if there is a measure around that, and there's a good debate about what is the measure around authenticity, about disinformation and truth, and there's a lot of work that's been done on this, then I think a measure could be traceable and could be used. I think maybe we should create the truth index when it comes to social media. And I know that the social media companies spend a lot of time ripping things out now and trying to put some metrics around it. It's clearly work in progress, but maybe we should create the truth index or the trust index around social media, and then that could be a metric that is actually put to use.
Jose, do you have a view on this?
Oh boy, we could do a whole panel on this issue, but I think we got to be very careful, when it comes to social media, right? The parts of that model clearly are built on reinforcing, right? Attracting more eyeballs, right? And that is then premised on giving people what they want or what they prefer, which may or may not be what is true or what is appropriate. So I think there's been a real rethinking in Silicon Valley about kind of the impact that business model has on society at large and how they can be better actors. And I think you're seeing this is one real example where I think some of what David and Antonio were talking about earlier, it's happening. And I think stakeholders across society, shareholders, and just individual citizens are putting these companies on the spotlight, and I do think that's going to result in a better process overall. It's not going to be a straight line, and it's going to be a little messy, and my truth apparently may be different than yours, and how do we get these companies to a point where we all agree that they're doing the best thing for society, or at least they're being good actors in society. I think there's a lot of debate around that, and I think to your point, it's what does that S really mean, right? Kind of to me may mean slavery or slave labor. To others may mean how do we have a more equitable society that's represent a company that's represented and governed by people that look like the rest of us. And to others, it may be exactly what you're talking about. What is the impact of that society? I think in general, I'm very contrarian about the whole topic of ESG, in the sense that we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? We need to move all these companies to a better place. And that means if there's a coal company that can do a little bit better by having clean coal, we should look at that. On the other hand, we shouldn't blindly start investing in electric vehicle companies, because we have to realize what David was talking about, that there's a real kind of total supply chain impact. And where do you get lithium batteries, and how do you mine lithium, and how do you dispose of it? And we may be thinking that we're doing things that are better for society, the environment, and our society, but we may not be. So I think we need to be very, very careful about just putting the ESG label on a specific sector or removing it from a specific sector. I think we need to move our society across the board to a better place, move them along that ESG spectrum, if you will.
Oh, wow. So it's time for the Q&A, which Sansio's sending over some questions, which I will put to you guys. But I feel like I can't let Livia let that. Who wants to respond to Jose and say, no, we should let the perfect be an enemy of the good, and we should stand up for black and white issues and not be okay with certain shades of gray in certain areas? Because I'm sure there's someone on here, if no one else than Livia, you will say, like, there are certain places that we shouldn't be content with, like, small moves in a certain direction.
I didn't hear that we should be content with shade of gray. I actually heard the opposite. I think also, though, that we are slightly confusing the issue in terms of communication and social media and digital media and what happens, in terms of how we collect information. Because one thing is what we experience with, as you said at the beginning, with the safety of election, for example, through all the, what we know about the Great Hack and Cambridge Analytica and all that happened and is still happening to our democracy, with actually how social media and marketing and communication is playing in our favor in terms of how fast information of slave labor and supply chain exploitations and pollutions are filtering through now, thanks to social media and communication. It's happened so fast. Like even, something like what's happening in China now in the cotton fields with the slave labor, which is a massive, massive issue that came out last autumn for the first time. And, we had slave labor in Uzbekistan for cotton for over, forever, and it's never been talked about much. I mean, some people like me and Antonio, for example, might have known about it, but not, the general population. And then suddenly in 5 months, 6 months, now we know all about China and what's happening in, in the cotton fields there. And so many brands are going to get implicated. And now they're looking at their supply chain thinking, oh my God, we have to act really fast. And are we really sourcing cotton from there? Or, oh my God, what's happening? So
this is actually a question which I have from one of the audience members, which is directly to this point for you. Tell me about what happened with the sexual abuse and harassment of 700 women in Lesotho who were supplying denim to US customers. Apparently that was in 2018 and the customers had no idea. Do you think that over the past 3 years, between 2018 and now, the customers of those kind of suppliers are genuinely more aware of what's going on and are changing their behavior?
100% they're more aware now today, 100%. And particularly the younger generation are really interested and care deeply. And, you mentioned that incident that happened in 2018, and there are many, many others that similarly, that I can promise you happen every single day in supply chains all over the world, where women get exploited and abused. But while before it might have been like one marketing disaster for a brand, today, they are much more vigilant because they know that the attention is on. So I think through the last 2 or 3 years, whether it's the global pandemic, whether before then, if you talk about sexual exploitation, the Me Too movement, for the first time exposed what was going on in such a privileged industry like Hollywood and, in the movie industry, but then also open up a whole box about what's happening across every single industry with women in supply chains. So I think, not that I think, but I know that every single, and this is why we're having this conversation today about the ESG. It's not anymore a moral issue. It's about, from an investment point of view, is it really worth it to invest in a business that has no future? The answer is no. So unless you consider this S in your investment portfolio, you might as well take your money, put it down the toilet, because in 2 or 3 years, it will be worth nothing.
I have a really good question for Jose here, which is basically what happens if one of your portfolio companies, let's say they report back some data about human capital or anything else, and doesn't reflect very well on them. And you're like, that's not data that I really want to make public. And you might share it with your LPs because they care, but like under various, conditions of confidentiality. Do you have any kind of regulated, can the SEC or anyone else force you to disclose data or no?
Well, right now, the private equity industry in the US is regulated by the SEC, as you point out. Most of the regulation right now, relates to things like obviously financial information and things like conflicts of interest. Those are definitely by and far the areas where the SEC has really focused. On the area of ESG, I think it's still very much the Wild West, where any data reported by companies like us is mostly voluntary. I think I would say pretty much all voluntary. I think if the question is, or is there room for regulation or a government role for the dissemination, the gathering and dissemination of data? I think the answer is probably, but I think this is a space, for example, where it's still it's still morphing, it's still changing. Like David mentioned, we're still trying to figure out, kind of what are the right metrics, right? I don't have the right answer. I'm pretty sure the SEC doesn't have the right answer on that front, right? I think what has worked probably better in our industry is industry bodies, primarily LPs, the investors that we respond to, get together like ILPA here in the US, and they, set out basically data forms and frameworks and things that they would like to see from us. And I think over time, there has been a consensus that has, we have gotten to a consensus in things like what type of financial data, how should we report that, what type of, how granular that should be. And I think we're going through the same thing in ESG, right? 5 years ago, I would rarely have to fill out an ESG questionnaire from one of our LPs. Now I would say probably over 50% of the investors in my funds have some form of ESG questionnaire or some type of data request related to ESG. I think that, in 10 years, in 5 years, probably that's going to be 100%. But my hope is that 100% is very well, or it's much more standardized, right? And that way we can really compare to each other, compare my companies. I can compare one company with another company, and I can also compare across different other private equity firms. I think there's always going to be a reluctance from folks like us in my industry to disclose bad information or information that makes them look bad. But I think that doesn't matter, right? If we get to the point where we're all disclosing the same information and we're looking at that information on an equal playing field, I think that's going to make all of us better. And if you are, ethical and truthful, you're going to have to report the good data or the data that puts you in a bad light with the data that puts you in a better light. And I think that's fair, and I think that's what we should strive for.
David, let me bring you in here to respond to that. And so just respond as well to a bigger question we have about this question of like incremental progress versus like, excuse me, but the world is on fire and incremental progress isn't going to be enough. What do you say to people who put it that incremental progress is really just another word for maintaining the status quo, which is incredibly damaging to billions of people around the world, and that instead of, worrying about reporting standards on the S and trying to get self-reporting, what we really need to do is just sort of tear the whole thing down and build it all back up from scratch.
Well, if I just compare the E and the S for a moment, climate has caught everyone's attention because there is a burning platform, and there's been many years where the standards have been developed. And the other thing too is that climate is industry agnostic. If you produce carbon or carbon equivalents, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you're producing the same level of carbon. The comparisons across industries might be different, an airline firm versus a grocer. But the actual standards and the disclosures are pretty much uniform, and that's why I think a lot of progress has been made. When you get into the S, you start looking at issues that are different by industry. We just talked about the fashion industry and the particular concern around slavery in the supply chain. But if you go into another industry, the social issues might be quite different. So we do have a little bit more complexity to work through. And I think our own experience is we work with many industry bodies around the world. like it or not, wrong or right, we tend to work, theme at a time. A lot of progress has been made in the UK on human slavery, a lot more to do, but there's groups that have a pretty good definition of what is the data that you should collect and what are the policy statements that should be had. But in other industries and other countries around the world, there's different themes and different areas. So it just is taking more time to sort this through. And climate has got the attention, and it's also more measurable. I mean, we have the move to carbon zero or 1.5 or 2 degrees. I mean, these are numbers. It's more measurable and more scientific, whereas S is actually a little less scientific, sometimes more debatable. I'd argue some areas are not for debate. Human slavery in the supply chain, it's a yes or a no, but other issues, there are more shades of gray, so it's more difficult to get the data and the metrics right. I think this point about private equity and private companies, don't underestimate the pressure from the LPs, but also the supply chain pressure. It's hard as a company now, unless you don't have any customers or any suppliers, so I'm trying to think what kind of company that isn't somehow having to report on some aspects of that, and that's only going to increase. So I imagine there's a lot of people around the world now figuring out, when I look at the top management team of my private company, how do I put the focus on the skills I need for the S reporting as well? And I think that is happening a lot. I hear from the headhunters about how many leaders of the future are called sustainable leaders. And the other final thing, which we haven't talked about, we employ 25,000 people in the world. Half of those are in Asia. The single largest question, and these are very young people working in technology and information, the single largest question after what's my role and how much money will I take home is, what is your policy around social and ESG issues for young employees around the world? And we shouldn't underestimate not just the consumers who might be interested about their denim jeans, but also our most important asset, our colleagues and the people that work with us. What do they care about? And it's becoming harder and harder as an employee to attract the right kind of person unless you've taken some of these issues seriously and you have a good story to tell about what you're actually doing. So I just wanted to bring that in because we haven't spoken about the employee base of them.
Absolutely. The employees, I believe the children are our future, as someone once said. I'm going to leave the last word to you, Antonio. We have a question for you, but you have roughly 1 minute to talk about the role of the media here in terms of filling these gaps and just responding to what everyone else has said.
I think the role of the media is crucial because it shines a light on issues such as all the issues that we've been discussing here. Going back to David's point and to the question that was raised earlier, I think if you take ESG seriously, you actually have a chance to, as an investor and even as a citizen who decides to how to spend their money, his or her money, I think we have a real chance here to affect change, which is quite systemic. If through the S of ESG taken seriously, looked at seriously through data, we're able, let's say, to eradicate slavery and forced labor within supply chain, to introduce minimum wage standards, to introduce gender parity when it comes to salary, stricter legislation, even around the issues that you were discussing earlier when it comes to digital rights and the risks for our democracy. That is a very, very interesting starting point that I would definitely not underestimate, and that definitely doesn't contribute to keeping the status quo.
Wonderful. Antonio, for an Italian, you managed to say that with incredible succinctness. Congratulations. Thank you for being on this panel. Thank you to Livia and David and Jose as well. This has been very, very instructive. And back to you, Santia.